If you grew up in Europe or North America, your choice of family car might have been dictated by budget, reliability, or perhaps a slight preference for one brand styling over another. You might have been a Volkswagen household or a Ford family, but it rarely defined your entire personality. In Australia, however, it was different. For nearly 40 years, the country was divided into two fiercely loyal tribes. You were either red or you were blue, Holden or Ford. And at the heart of this civil war were two large rear-wheel drive saloons built specifically to conquer the harsh, unforgiving Australian landscape, the Ford Falcon and the Holden Commodore. It's a battle that shaped a nation's car culture, dominated its racetracks, and ultimately ended in heartbreak for both sides. This is the Falcon versus Commodore story. To understand this rivalry, we have to go back to 1960. General Motors' Australian subsidiary Holden completely dominated the local market. They built Australia's own car, rugged, simple, and perfectly suited for the corrugated dirt tracks of the outback. Ford Australia wanted a piece of the action. Instead of engineering a car from scratch to challenge the Holden Standard and Special, they imported a car from Detroit, the 1960 Ford Falcon. It was low, sleek, and futuristic. Beside it, the Holden Special looked like something from the previous decade. But there was a problem. The American-designed Falcon wasn't built for Australia. Front suspension collapsed, clutches burnt out, and the car quickly gained a reputation for fragility. It was beautiful, but it seemed to be made of glass. Ford had to take quick action to make the Falcon competitive. They re-engineered the car, making it tough enough to survive the bush. But despite this, Holden still ruled the roost, taking almost a third of the Australian car market, and the updated American shapes of the 1962 model kept it ahead. There would be punch and counterpunch from America's two biggest rivals. The Falcon and the Standard Special got almost yearly updates, sometimes a restyle, sometimes a new engine, sometimes a more radical reworking of the chassis. Ford gave the Falcon the Mustang-bred V8 engine, creating the Falcon GT. Suddenly, the humble family saloon was a muscle car. Holden countered with the gorgeous Monaro Coupe. The Holden Standard and Special was eventually rebranded as the Kingswood. The rivalry was cemented not just on the showroom floor, but at a place called Mount Panorama in Bathurst, a daunting mountainous racetrack where those heavy road cars were pushed to their absolute limits in a grueling 500-mile endurance race. So by the late 1970s, you can see there was no quarter given between Ford and Holden. Both fought on equal terms, building large rugged cars tailored specifically for the vast distances of the Australian continent. But 1978 marked change, and each car would choose its own very different path. It was a multi-million-dollar gamble that split the nation down the middle. Holden was first out the gates, and they took a big gamble. Global oil crises meant heavy, big cars were falling out of favour. And what's more, it no longer made sense to build a custom platform just for the Australian market. So, like Ford had looked to Detroit for the Falcon in the early 60s, Holden looked to GM's European division Opel. The Commodore used the 1977 Opel Rekord Vauxhall Cavalier platform with the front of the Opel Senator grafted on for good measure. Inside it was mostly Opel Rekord bits. The chassis was of course beefed up to survive Australian roads, and despite the fuel crisis, Holden dropped in their existing Australian engines, starting with a 2.8 litre six-cylinder and going all the way up to a 5 litre V8. But with a lighter, smaller chassis and body, handling was greatly improved. The Holden Commodore was born. Meanwhile, Ford looked at the same global market and decided to stick with the full-size Falcon. The new 1979 Ford Falcon might look like a Ford Granada from Europe, but underneath it was an Aussie-engineered Ford Falcon chassis through and through. The only Granada bits on the Falcon were the headlights. At first, Holden looked like the smart move. The motoring press had swooned over it, giving it the Wheels Car of the Year award. The press thought Ford was being stubborn and old-fashioned, but when the two cars met in the real world, the tables quickly turned. Australia is a massive country, and buyers, especially families, taxi drivers and police forces, well, they wanted legroom and they wanted a big boot. The Commodore felt cramped, struggling to fit 3 in the back, and its European steering rack struggled on rough country roads. To make matters worse, the 6-cylinder engine Holden were using dated back to 1948, and it showed, certainly when compared to the Falcon. When unleaded petrol came in, Holden was forced to use a Nissan engine. Ford's gamble to do the status quo paid off. The large Falcon took the sales crown, and Holden spent the next decade playing catch-up. They progressively updated the Commodore, tweaking the styling and improving the engines, but they couldn't stretch the cabin. It was now 1988, and after 10 years both cars needed an update. Ford struck first and unveiled the new EA Series Falcon. Marketing confidently called it simply stunning, and visually it really was. Ford had once again taken the European Ford Granada as inspiration. It was sleek, possessing flush-fitting glass and a much lower drag coefficient. Engine capacity had been reduced. There was now just a 3.2 litre and a 3.9 litre 6-cylinder engine. Ford kept the generous interior proportions that Australians loved, and orders flooded in. Ford dealers were ecstatic. The Falcon looked absolutely unbeatable. But beneath the stunning surface, there were problems, at least initially. In Ford's rush to beat the Commodore to market, early cars suffered from terrible panel fitment. There were front suspension alignment problems, and the base 3.2 litre engine that was so underpowered that Ford quietly discontinued it within months. Ford had the look, but they hadn't quite finished the car. Could Holden capitalise on Ford's stumble? The public found out 5 months later when the new Commodore appeared. Holden knew that if they built another small car, the company was finished. They needed a big car, but they didn't have the budget to engineer one from scratch, so a bit of lateral thinking was needed. They once again looked to Europe, taking the body of the Opel Omega, but slicing the floor pan down the middle and widening it by nearly 10 centimetres. It still wasn't as wide as a Falcon, but it got a lot closer. To power this wider beast, the marketing department insisted that this big Aussie car needed a big Aussie engine. They'd seen the mistake Ford had made with their 3.2 litre. So they sourced a relatively primitive 3.8 litre pushrod V6 from Buick in the United States. It wasn't sophisticated and it sounded quite coarse when pushed, but it did the job. Holden knew that sourcing a platform from Europe would mean a lighter vehicle. That's part of the reason for going that direction in 1978. And this time, the new, larger Commodore was lighter than the Falcon, a massive 107 kilograms. That's like having a full-grown breeding ram sitting in the back seat, not something that will help performance. So with a smooth 4-speed automatic, the new Commodore didn't just drive, it launched. When the motoring press pitted the two cars against each other, the battle was razor thin. The Falcon was praised for its superior steering, maturity and better interior ergonomics. The Commodore was lauded for its relentless pace, excellent fuel economy and effortless overtaking power. But ultimately, the coveted 1988 Wheels Car of the Year trophy went to the Commodore. Holden was back in the game. And they were first out the gate when it came to the next generation in 1997. The sharp, boxy edges that had defined the 1980s were long gone, replaced with soft, organic, flowing curves. It was smooth, cohesive, and possessed a wide, aggressive stance that made it look far more expensive than it actually was. Underneath, Holden followed the same playbook that had worked so well last time, taking the largest European Opel, in this case the 1994 Omega, widening it and making it strong enough for Australia. It gained independent rear suspension across the range, bringing a level of ride sophistication previous models simply couldn't match. The Australian public fell in love instantly. Waiting lists at Holden dealerships stretched out for months. But wait, there was a new Falcon a year later. How would that stack up? Well, they'd spent 700 million Australian dollars or 370 million pounds developing their counterpunch. Mechanically, it was arguably the superior machine. It had been put on a diet, it was now lighter than the Commodore and featured incredibly durable engines, including the heavily updated version of Ford's bulletproof 4-litre straight 6. Ford's new edge styling was sweeping all the awards in Europe. It was on the car and the Focus. Why not the Falcon? Surely it would attract a younger generation of buyers with its avant-garde looks. The result was a heavily arched roofline and drooping front and carved-out headlights. It split opinion, but not in a good way. Fleet buyers walked away, taxi companies hesitated, and traditional Ford families openly defected to Holden. Ford tried to expunge the look as soon as possible, but the damage had been done. Sales plummeted. It was a visual misstep so severe that it instantly handed the sales crown to Holden on a silver platter. The new Commodore didn't just sell well, it became a cultural phenomenon, quickly securing its place as Australia's favourite car. By the mid-2000s, the automotive landscape in Australia was facing a quiet but terrifying shift. Not only were protections on the local car industry eroding, exposing the Commodore and the Falcon to outside competition, but customers were moving away from big saloons and towards SUVs that had no problem facing the rough and tumble of Australia and seating up to 7 in comfort. Yet, inside the design studios of Melbourne and Adelaide, the mood wasn't one of defeat, it was one of defiance. Rather than quietly managing the decline, Ford and Holden poured billions of dollars into creating the most advanced, highly sophisticated and powerful cars the continent had ever seen. And it was Holden first again for the new generation car in 2006. Every single previous Commodore had been heavily adapted versions of an Opel platform, but Opel had given up on large saloons, so Holden had to go it alone, developing their own all-new rear-wheel drive platform, which would later be borrowed for cars like the Chevy Lumina and the Pontiac G8. All that work cost a pretty penny, a staggering 1 billion Australian dollars or 530 million pounds, requiring over 1,000 engineers working for 5 years to bring it to life. Visually, the new Commodore fit the bill. The massive wheels were pushed right out to the absolute corners of the car, giving it short overhangs and aggressive, muscular, flared front wheel arches. Underneath, a sophisticated new multi-link rear suspension setup gave it handling that could genuinely benchmark against high-end German sports saloons. It was safer, stiffer, and vastly more advanced than anything Holden had built before, and allied to a range of engines from a 3-litre V6 to a 7-litre V8 on later high-performance models. Ford had 2 years to respond, and they needed something to regain the lead that they'd lost 20 years earlier. Gone was the despised new edge styling for something that Ford hoped the public would actually like. There would appear a 2-litre EcoBoost engine for fuel economy, but also a hard-driving 5.4-litre V8. But maybe the most interesting was a heavily updated version of Ford's legendary Barra 4-litre inline-6. In the high-performance XR6 turbo model, this delivered 270 kilowatts or 362 horsepower that hit like a sledgehammer. The Barra Turbo didn't just compete with Holden's 6-litre V8, it regularly humiliated it in straight-line acceleration, cementing itself as one of the greatest 6-cylinder engines ever engineered. And the battle of the Falcon and Commodore didn't just happen on public roads. On the mountain at Bathurst, the racing versions of these cars banged doors at 300 kilometers an hour. In the grandstands, fans wearing Ford blue and Holden red threw insults and occasionally fists at each other. This was tribalism. If your dad drove a Falcon, you hated the Commodore. There was no middle ground. But while the fans were cheering at the racetrack, the market for the Falcon and Commodore was fading. There were those SUVs, dual cab pickups, or even more fuel-efficient hatchbacks. Production costs were high, export markets were limited, which made the addressable market relatively small, especially when you're spending $1 billion Australian dollars on developing a new vehicle. Ford threw in the towel. Production of their car ended in 2016. But Holden knew that although the market might be smaller, many of those Falcon customers would have no choice but to embrace the dark side and buy a Commodore. Well, it had a Commodore badge on it, but like the previous versions, it had been born elsewhere. This time it was a Vauxhall Opel Insignia, also sold as the Buick Regal. and it also wasn't produced in Australia. Holden's factories had been shuttered in 2017, so the whole car was manufactured at Opel's factory in Germany. But it was still a Commodore, and it had been re-engineered and overhauled for our Australian market. Holden had learned that lesson in 1978. The engines were different from previous cars though. There was the option of two different 2-litre 4-cylinder engines, both with turbos, a petrol and a diesel from Fiat. There was a nod to the larger, more powerful engines Australia was used to with a 3.6-litre V6, but it was the first Commodore to not feature a V8. But was this really a Commodore, or was it just another foreign import? The public never warmed to the car, and GM announced the end of the historic Holden name in 2020, and the Commodore was retired. The Falcon and the Commodore were born out of a specific need to conquer a vast, rugged continent. They grew to become cultural icons, fueling a fierce motorsport passion and provided a soundtrack to generations of Australian road trips. Today the factories are gone and the grandstands of Bathurst host different cars. But on the roads of Australia, you'll still see them, the rumbling V8s and whistling turbos, immaculately preserved by a generation of fans who refuse to let the fire die. The war between red and blue may be over, but the legacy of the Falcon and the Commodore remains a defining chapter in the history of the Australian big car. If you want to learn about the European versions of the Commodore, take a look at my Omega video on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.